done since the last exam. ADHD, externalizing problems, which includes conduct disorder, oppositional defiance disorder. We talked a little bit about intermittent explosive disorder, particularly in the guest lecture. I didn't really cover it, but we talked about that. And then this week, so we started covering communication disorders. So all the different like articulation, all those different expressive and receptive issues, speech sound disorder. And then we also started covering learning disorders, which we just finished on Wednesday. So the learning disorders included things like specific learning disorder with impairment in writing, reading, and math. So that's where we're at. We're now covering intellectual disabilities today. And then next week we cover, the whole week will just be autism plus schizophrenia, or pediatric schizophrenia. So we'll do that Monday and Wednesday. And then next Friday, so a week from today, is our next exam review. So it's putting together all the topics I just mentioned. So it's a little bit more compact, I think, than last exam because we're covering more sections of the DSM, whereas the first exam was more about like theory and what are the different models that we use in abnormal child psych. So I think in terms of this next exam, there's more content to cover. So the exam will look a little bit different in that you'll have, I think, more case vignettes applying different, like you'll get a case vignette. What does it sound like this client potentially may have as a disorder? What are some of the treatments you might recommend? So we've talked about so far in terms of treatment, a lot for ADHD and externalizing problems. So I would expect that on the exam. And then we'll talk more next week about what else you can expect. So just orienting you, we really only have like 1.5 more topics up until the next exam. Okay, I will cover intellectual disabilities next. Okay, so you guys should see everything. Okay, so this is chapter 12, intellectual disabilities. And I think it should be up on Canvas already. And just to orient you in the DSM in terms of where does everything lie, we have 3 sections in the DSM. Section 1 is just all introductory, like just random paperwork, like telling you who the people on the steering committees were for the APA work groups, general ways of how to use the DSM. So not really anything people usually read. Section 2 is this giant section, and it's primarily where you're going to look when you're opening the DSM to look up diagnostic criteria for a particular disorder. So all of section 2 in the DSM is different disorders, what are the categories of disorders, and what's the criteria in each of those disorders. And there's some additional information about like prevalence rates, some differential diagnoses, like what tends to cluster together, what do you need to use a differential diagnosis for, things like that. And then section 3, we'll talk about mainly when we talk about personality disorders, but section 3 is really where they include like emerging models. So things that are not necessarily a disorder or nothing in section 2 yet, or that could quite make it to section 2, but things about where research is leading us, where there are certain models that specific groups are beginning to adopt and they're hoping will make it into section 2. And there are other like interviews. So there's a cultural formulation interview that is in section 3, but not in section 2. So that's the makeup of the DSM. And so what I'm showing you here is where are we right now in terms of diagnostic criteria that we've covered. So we have talked about neurodevelopmental disorders. So it's in this larger umbrella within the DSM. We're going to cover intellectual disabilities, this thing on top. We did communication. You can ignore this earlier week. Oh, actually, no, this is true. Covered earlier this week, communication disorders. We talked about that. We also talked about specific learning disorders. We covered this 2 weeks ago, I think, with right before Shira guest lectured, so ADHD. And today we're covering this. We're not covering motor disorders and other neurodevelopmental disorders. Okay, so broadly, so since you know it's now in this section of neurodevelopmental disorders, broadly what we're talking about is a group of disorders where the onset of symptoms or the things that occur to make us suspect that it might be a specific disorder. So those symptoms occur during a certain developmental period. So it typically manifests in early childhood, and that's why so far you've seen a lot of specifiers where it says onset is required to have occurred in childhood, even if the symptoms don't fully manifest until later on. So with communication disorders, we talked about it needs to happen like in a specific period where we're starting to notice impairment, and usually that happens in a school age range when they're going to school and the demand gets greater and you're noticing more differences across their peers. Same thing with learning disorders, which we just covered on Wednesday. I think for each one of the impairments we looked at, they all said some sort of qualifier about onset in childhood. And for most of those school-aged range because that's when you're in school learning to read, write, and apply math in more sophisticated ways. So all of these have some sort of early onset in a specific developmental period. Each one of these disorders, so going back, so any of these groups of disorders is going to look like different developmental deficits or differences in brain processes, which then lead to impairment in functioning across different settings. So going back, we suspect, just like we've talked about in nearly all disorders, there's going to be some sort of contribution from the neurobiological standpoint, the environmental standpoint, and that environmental standpoint is going to include things like parenting, any genetic risk in between, well, that's actually neurobiological, but any genetic risk between parents. So we're always going to consider those different domains that contribute to a disorder, but specifically for the neurodevelopmental disorders, there tend to be greater evidence of some like neurological differences. So if you do like brain structure, like brain imaging studies, you'll notice maybe some functional abnormalities in the different brains of control groups without a neurodevelopmental disorder and in a target group with a neurodevelopmental disorder, which is why it's clustered under this section of neurodevelopmental disorders, because we tend to see some of these developmental differences in terms of growth or development and or some differences in brain processes. And that's why we have a range of impairment from specific to very broad. So intellectual disabilities is different than communication disorders, is different than specific learning disorders. They all have something in common, which is why it's in this section, but each thing has a particular focus, if you will. DSM-5 intellectual disabilities, so remember that's within the neurodevelopmental section, includes things like intellectual disability or intellectual developmental disorder, things like global developmental delay, and then unspecified. Within every section, you're always going to see some sort of unspecified or other impairment. And it's basically like a catch-all phrase for if someone, so like for example, down here, other specified neurodevelopmental disorder or unspecified neurodevelopmental disorder. It's basically saying this client that you're talking about meets criteria for something within the neurodevelopmental disorders realm, but doesn't quite present as intellectual disability, communication, ADHD, autism, specific learning motor disorders. None of those quite describe what this client looks like in terms of their presentation, what their impairments are. And so since we don't have a really good answer, we are not able to give one of these diagnoses. We say something like other specified, like we think there's some other etiological factor. So instead of saying, well, it's actually a language disorder, we're saying it's an unspecified communication disorder. We could say it's in general rather than a specific communication or ADHD thing. We're saying it's just generally a neurodevelopmental disorder, but it's other because we don't know what it is, and we're going to suggest it's this one thing, or we say it's unspecified, where we're not really saying there is a particular hypothesis about what the thing is. So personally, I don't see people using other specified that often. I usually see unspecified if they're going to use one of these things. But this isn't unique to neurodevelopmental disorders. I think it's in every section you're going to see some sort of other or unspecified. So going back to where we are here, I'm not going to talk about unspecified. Really what we care about in terms of the lecture is intellectual disability. Okay, this is our little code word. Are you guys ready? Wait, hold on. Let me stop sharing for our code word. Okay, it just stopped recording.